Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back. And we're so pleased that you're here for our next session, which is The Turning Page, Sarg's Illustrations for the Martial Adventures of Henry and Me with Catherine Schlogic. And I'll just start by saying that thrilled to have Catherine with us. We're going to look a little bit, of course, as we have in the exhibition, at Sarg's whimsical drawing style, of course, his gift for visual storytelling and ability to capture the comedic moments which made him an apt and able artist for popular periodicals and books for all ages. In addition to the many children's books that he wrote and illustrated, Sarg also created drawings for humor books for adults by noted authors Irvin S. Cobb, Belle K. Manyantes, and William Allen White. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Catherine Walker Schlogic, who happens also to be White's granddaughter and associate curator of education at the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art at Kansas State University. And that museum, the Beach Museum, is the lender of an important series of drawings to the exhibition from the book, The Martial Adventures of Henry and Me, and they are really quite wonderful. So Catherine is going to discuss Sarg's illustrations for this World War I era book, which is based on the letters that White sent home to his family. And an interesting note here is that Catherine first encountered Sarg's work when she served as assistant curator at the Nantucket Historical Association in the mid-1980s. So she's kind of coming home again with these, which is wonderful. But she is also a Kansas State University Civic Engagement Fellow, and she works with Kansas Child Care Training Opportunities, Inc. as an online trainer. Welcome, Catherine. We are so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here and to share this story. I am going to go ahead and try to share my screen.
And I'm so glad you contacted me to let me know of your connection with White, which we had not been aware of.
Well, it was, of course, when we were starting the loan process, we're a very small staff, so it was obvious that they would say, "Oh, guess what?" So, it was really exciting, and I've had fun sharing the catalog with my father. He's really enjoyed it, and he and my mother are the ones who had donated the drawings to the Beach Museum of Art. So we still have one that we've kept, but the rest are here at the museum. So
That's wonderful.
What I'd like to do is really kind of tell you the stories of the Martial Adventures of Henry and Me, and start out with the fact that one of the things I think is interesting is that I believe for this book, Tony Sarg really did do a lot of research for these drawings, and especially for the different uniforms. But you can see in this first slide here, the original drawing, the dust jacket for the book, and then the photograph of Henry J. Allen and William Allen White in 1917 in these lieutenant colonel uniforms. So I think, this is a book that these illustrations, and as you see the different uniforms, I think Sarg must have really have done some in-depth research into the different uniforms of the different soldiers. The book comes about as William Allen White, who was the editor of the Emporia Gazette, and Henry J. Allen, who was the owner of the Wichita Beacon and then later governor of Kansas, were asked to travel as inspectors for the Red Cross. And the idea was for them to visit some of the 134 base and evacuation hospitals in France. Martial Adventures of Henry and Me supposedly started out as letters home to his wife Sally and children Bill and Mary, but he writes in his autobiography that his wife had encouraged him to write the book after he got back from France. What's interesting is that he had already, by the time he arrived in France in August of 1917, had immediately written to Macmillan and Harper Brothers about the book. So I think the book was in his head the whole time. So I think what he wrote in his autobiography is perhaps a little bit of fiction. um, he also writes to another friend in Paris that the book would be about salvage or saving from the wreck and waste of war. The book was published in 1918 and it was widely advertised and reviewed. Um, by this point in time, William Allen White had published 8 of the 22 books that he would publish, and he was already well known for an editorial called What's the Matter with Kansas, which was published in 1896. All of the reviews mention Tony Sarg's drawings. The inimitable sketches of Tony Sarg distributed throughout lend a clever and human atmosphere to the text. Tony Sarg's drawings are in keeping with the liveliness of the text. They're humorous illustrations by Tony Sarg. And White wrote that in his autobiography that it sold well, 40 or 50,000 copies, but mentions that the English would have none of it. The humorous parts offended them. They could not conceive of a writer joking with death. The book outlived the war. It remained in print until the need for lead in World War II turned the plates to bullets. So I think, there were good reviews and bad reviews, and I have not been able to find any of the British reviews, but I could see, how the humor might be taken a bit awry. So let me introduce you to our sort of creative team. We have William Allen White, who was born in Emporia, Kansas in 1868, pursued a career as a newspaperman, but also a writer. Never actually finished his college degree from the University of Kansas, but was incredibly well read, very involved in world politics. He purchased the Emporia Gazette in 1895, and he also was very interested in art. And we don't know whether he ever met Tony Sarg. He spent quite a bit of time in New York City, and it's highly possible that they could have met, but we just have no real idea. But one of the big things that White is famous for in Kansas is the tragic prelude mural by John Stuart Curry, which is in the state capitol in Topeka. And William Allen White led the fundraising efforts and the move to bring Curry back to Kansas to create these murals. The letters would have been sent to his wife, Sally, who was a teacher that he met while he was working on the Kansas City Star. His daughter, Mary, who unfortunately was killed in a horse riding accident. And one of White's famous editorials was about the death of his daughter. And he always called her Peter Pan. He was great friends with J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. And then Bill White, who became an accomplished writer in his own right, with 14 books, and 3 of which were turned. 3 of his books were turned into films. With the keen interest in world politics, White was actually chosen to go back to France for the Paris Peace Accords, and his son Bill traveled with him. And White was friends with all of the presidents, from Teddy Roosevelt through Herbert Hoover. Didn't like Wilson's politics, and then worked with Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. White died on Kansas Day in 1944. Henry Allen was also a newspaperman and owned numerous newspapers. After their first trip to France, he goes immediately back to work for the YMCA at this point. and is nominated for governor of Kansas while he is there. And there is a thought that the book, White wrote the book partly in order to sort of market his friend Henry Allen for the governorship. During his second trip, Allen was working on the communication lines for the wounded American soldiers. Tony Sarg's drawing reappears later on after Allen becomes a governor. William and Allen White and Henry J. Allen have another martial adventure where the two of them disagree on the right of railroad men to strike. And so here they come again in their uniforms. And Allen actually even arrests William Allen White at that point. And then finally, we have Tony Sarg. I think at this point, you know, we have talked quite a bit about Sarg. Of course, the marionettes, the balloons, wonderful information from Nantucket. And so I want to address a little bit more some of his work as an illustrator. Sarg actually comes to the United States in 1914, and he probably comes because of the anti-German feeling in London, where he is currently living. And this is a postcard by him. And you can see that we have sort of the typical German shopkeeper changing his shop, putting up an English name, buying British goods, getting rid of anything that is German. So Sarg's move is quite likely due to this anti-German sentiment. What he had been doing quite actively was actually sort of really supporting the war effort with a lot of his art. He worked for the London Transport for doing posters for the Underground. And in 1913, he'd done a series of 12 posters. And in 1914, once the war starts, he redoes a poster called Toyland Mobilizing for Christmas. The sketches on the right-hand side ran in several different newspapers, and there are sketches of entertainers in the music halls singing patriotic songs. So when Sarg comes to New York, it makes sense for him to continue working on the illustrations. And he very quickly fits in with fellow illustrators and writers and performers. And this is where he may very well have met William Allen White at some point. He does do one other book with a World War I theme, and that is this book by Frank Ward O'Malley. And again, it's a satirical book, so the illustrations are humorous. The illustrations are done in ink, and then they were reproduced in the book using photomechanical halftones, which is a process where they are photographed through a screen, and then it's sort of a dot matrix sort of method of printing. And it works very well for drawings. You can maintain the flow of the pen and ink. Let's see, sorry. So the reason the book is humorous is because White wants people to actually read it. And so he talks about the fact that he has to find some sort of a vehicle besides just telling the stories of his trip to the front. And so some of the things that he does are to add humor. He has all sorts of clothing mishaps, starting with this first one, where he and Alan are in New York City buying uniforms from a supply store, and complaining that the uniforms cost $28. And that their wives would be very upset that they were spending so much money on these uniforms. The funny thing is they get to Paris and the Red Cross tells them that those uniforms are not appropriate at all, that they have to buy new uniforms at about 4 times the price. So they end up, having to completely start over. In addition, once they get onto the boat, they White introduces some fictional characters. What he tries to do is to put a love story into sort of this horror of war. And one of the discussions that goes on is, how can people fall in love during war when everything is so horrible? So we have sort of this fictional love triangle that White says he pastes sort of 3 or 4 people that he met on his travels like paper dolls on the Gossamer story, giving them assumed names, letting them talk in imaginary dialogues, and moving about most conventionally towards a happy ending. So the first that we meet is the eager young soul, Miss Ingersoll. And she is one of the more than 23,000 young women who went over to be nurses for the Red Cross. We also meet the Gilded Youth, who is a wealthy young man volunteering as an ambulance driver, and a young doctor. And they form a love triangle. In addition, we meet the princess. And this is kind of interesting. For some reason, they decided what this says here is take out the cigar and smoke. And you can see here that he's got the cigar in his hand and the smoke coming up. And here there's kind of just this blank space where they've somehow taken that out, not on the original drawing, but somehow in the reproduction. And you can again see that whether through the whole book, White talks about himself and Henry Allen in a very humorous fashion. They're 40, they're 40-ish bald, fat men from the Midwest. And you can see how Sarg has really picked up on them as sort of these almost caricatures of who they really are in his illustrations. And here's one of the examples of where Sarg probably had to do some work, researching the different uniforms. The love triangle will continue to show up, but they wave the 3 off and are finally in Paris. I wanted to just point out that we've got this very dark drawing and how Sarg has added gouache, or the opaque watercolor in here, to create some lighter, whiter parts in the drawing. Almost looks like he's used whiteout. And then some other things have happened in this drawing, including something being added to this trunk. So somewhere in the process, there are some changes made in the drawings. While they're in Paris, they have another one of their clothing mishaps. And this one is sort of a catastrophe. It turns out that William Allen White's pants are 8 inches too short around the waist, and he can't get them up. And so they enlist a French housemaid to take part of his shirt out of the back and apply it into his pants So he's running around. Luckily, the jacket evidently covers it. And this is kind of the last of the humor for a bit, because then they head to the front. And where they head is this whole region of Verdun on the Western Front. And my belief is that the young doctor was stationed at Rimecourt, which was the U.S. Army base hospital in the area. White has to change the names of the towns and also of some of the people in order to protect them, in order not to give away where things are to the German army, since as he's writing this, the fighting is still going on. But you can see the ambulance corps, the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, and they're going to travel with them. And then also this base hospital, and they will go to the base hospitals, but they will also go to hospitals on the front lines. So our first adventure is on the front lines. They are at this point on the Western Front. They're looking across at Hill 208, which the Germans still have control of. You can see our characters down here, and this is a major who obviously has not spent much time on the German lines, because he stands up and makes himself a perfect target for the German guns. And the French soldiers in this picture are all yelling at him to get down so that he doesn't get shot. So this is a major that they're traveling with, who's part of the Red Cross, but not a skilled soldier. And again, you can see that probably Sarg has done some research, on what the trenches look like, because his renditions are really quite accurate. They continue on to Rockwell, and then are shot at there. And all along this area are these sort of shelters dug into the hills called a breeze. This is when these volleys of shells will come in, where people will shelter. And so we're really starting to get into battle here. There are, all sorts of shootings, there's deaths. So the book isn't entirely humorous. There are very accurate details about the battles. And then they go up Hill 304, which is one of where they encounter more enemy fire. And as they are diving for cover, guess what happens to the pants and the extra piece of cloth? It falls apart. And so here we have another one of our humorous clothing mishaps, leaving the tension in the story. And so here is White walking down the hill, holding his pants up because they are ripped. And then this gentleman here was just standing by the tree. The shell hits, everybody expects him to be dead, and he pops back up and lights a cigarette. And so there are lots of sort of these anecdotes of how people are handling the war, as well as we meet some of these people going along. From there, they go to one of the hospitals, and again encounter Miss Ingersoll, the eager soul. And this is one of the events where the love triangle comes back. If you look carefully back here, this is the Gilded Youth. And he is talking to his aunt, who is the major funder for the hospital. And it turns out that probably his aunt is the very famous Mrs. W.K. Vanderbilt, who did much of the funding for the war hospitals in France. And it also turns out that Mrs. Vanderbilt also knows the father of Miss Ingersoll, and they so we're seeing, you know, who it is that is going over there. Now by this time the eager soul is not so eager anymore. The head nurse has been killed, getting the girls into an abri, and she is now going to become an assistant to the new head nurse. So we're, you know, starting to see some of these real war stories come in. And you can see the much more serious looks on everybody's faces. After that, they head back to Paris. One of the things they talk about was the fact that there was no water. They had to drink wine or coffee. The coffee was very weak and the wine tasted like pokeberries. And so their first meal back in Paris, they drink 3 liters of water. And then there's a series of stories on their way out to visit Pershing's American troops, where they run into people. And this is an American couple here, helping them with their car, but telling them at the same time about all of the bombings in this village where they are, and the deaths and the disease. So we're, you know, getting these stories put in. We meet one of our American soldiers on a donkey. I love this illustration. And again, you can see sort of the difference in the uniforms. This is in a town where the 2 newspaper men are amazed to find that there are no newspapers, that everything is done by a town crier. They run into Dorothy Canfield Fisher, who is another writer, was a friend of White's, and I believe also knew Tony Sarg. And she tells them a story, which Sarg illustrates here, of 2 French enlisted men. Evidently during the war, they were allowed to ride along the sides of the trains to get free rides. And what they're doing is leaning in and basically panhandling. They're going on leave and they are going into the windows and asking the people in the cars for money. And what happens is they jump into the car and start telling all sorts of horrible war stories. And again, the Canadians, they had been really lambasted, and so they weren't taking prisoners. They finished their trip by going first to Italy. They meet the doctor again. He's been injured. We also find out that the Gilded Youth has been killed in a plane crash. And then finally, they head back home from England. And at the very end of the book, I'll just finish up quickly, we find out that the Gilded Youth, the Eager Young Soul, and the Doctor are all fictional characters, but they're all sort of characters that White and Allen aspire to be. So there's a very beautiful ending to the book in that way. And a song. And this is a soldier's song. It's before the Gilded Youth dies. He whistles the melody to the Eager Young Soul. She writes it down and sends it to the doctor, and the doctor writes the poem that goes with the song. And so that's kind of the final illustration in the book.
And that was wonderful. Thank you for bringing together both the artistry and the historical background, and of course your personal family background. When did you become aware, you know, of the book in your own life and begin to do research on it?
The research really came about once we donated the artworks to the Beach Museum. That was the point where I really wanted to research them. I had the drawings had been around in the family for quite some time. And I sort of remember the fact that we had those drawings. And so when I ended up on Nantucket, and found out that Sarg had this huge relationship with Nantucket, it was kind of an exciting moment. You know, this girl from Kansas ending up on Nantucket with this, you know, sort of amazing tie. So, yeah, when we donated, so that would have been in 2017. That was the point that I really began the research, and then certainly did some brushing up for this.
Wonderful. And did your grandfather leave papers, or are those located in any collection somewhere?
Yes. There's a large collection at the Library of Congress. There are collections at the University of Kansas, and then at Emporia State University. And then you know, his books, editorials, you know, a great, really large body of writing left behind, including lots of letters.
Wonderful. Well, we're so glad that you shared this information with us. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's a really wonderful story. So if you have a chance to pick the book up, I know, Lenore, you read it as well. I don't know if you have any comments.
I enjoyed reading the book and was particularly taken with the sort of, I guess, a Midwestern sensibility that was expressed visually through the drawings, as you pointed out, but also in terms of these two men, you know, again, middle-aged, overweight, they discuss that, but how fascinated they were with the nuances of budding romances and why they took this young woman into their hearts. And, you know, it was, I think, a lovely parallel to basically the horrors of war. And it also brings to mind that Sarg was not, I don't believe he was an apolitical artist. I think that some of his work was politically motivated. We have some examples of that, especially around World War I.
Yeah.
He didn't really live much into World War II as it was. He was, but because since he died in 1942. But and then also you pointed out very and interestingly that he had to leave England, UK, because of the anti-German sentiment. And in fact, though, early on in his career, you know, he did work
in the army.
Yeah, he was in the army. And so I wonder, you know, that was maybe a psychological tension for him between, you know, his very rigorous military career and his artistic nature, which was so playful and enjoyed a sense of humor and joy of life. But I do think that his political leanings, and he did address them in a number of books. And we decided that close to 25 books that existed that he illustrated. And every once in a while I find another book, and you know, that's a whole fascinating topic. And his style was different in different, of course, expressing the nature of the writing of the books. So.
Yeah, no, the stylistically, you know, the adult illustrations are really quite different from what he was doing with the children's books. And you know, it's always interesting to see an illustrated adult book, because we very rarely see today books for adults illustrated. So I think that's interesting as well. And not all of William Allen White's books were illustrated. I think there's only 2 or 3 that actually were illustrated, and the rest of the 22 were not. So
Thank you.
We do have one question from the audience, but I think you may have addressed this a bit. The question is whether they actually had any synergy while the book was being created. So Sarg and White, and whether one would have affected the other. But it sounds like not
been
necessarily.
looking and
no.
looking and looking to
Mm.
to try to find something. I have not found any record of letters between the two of them. You know, it's typical in the publishing field for an illustrator and a writer to never meet.
Right.
So we just don't know. It certainly feels like it. You know, as you look at the book, it certainly feels like they must have worked together, but I have no proof of that. But if they didn't, it's just a real testament to Sarg's ability to look at that book and really capture it. You know, that's a talent in itself, is, you know, to take something that's not yours and then translate it into, you know, these wonderful illustrations.
Yes, and to pull out those kind of seminal moments as he did. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion of this fantastic book and of your family's heritage. And we were so glad to have you with us, Catherine.
Well, thank you, and I enjoyed my virtual tour last night. So,
Oh, thank you so much.
loved seeing a little bit of Nantucket this morning. So, made me feel a little homesick.
Definitely wish we were there, right?
Right.
Well, we thank you all for listening. We are going to come back in just a few minutes at 1:30 and talk a lot about Macy's, which will be fun. So thanks again, Catherine, and we'll see everybody back here in just a few minutes.